Alright, welcome back to a new TouchDesigner tutorial. And today we're going to look at Halftone. And according to Adobe, Halftone is a 20th century printing technique in which patterns of dots create images. So basically, back in the day, printing processes were quite limited, and Halftone was a way to create the appearance of colors and shades. And nowadays it's really more of a vintage photo effect. And we're going to look at how to build that with instancing in TouchDesigner. Our printers are always printing in CMYK, but for our case, we're actually going to be working with RGB. So let's have a quick look at what we're going to be building here. So I have 3 different inputs I'm going to be using to show this. So it's this photo of a woman, a video of clouds, and a dinosaur. So right, as you can see, it kind of changes based on the resolution. So we have a lot of different ways here to adapt this to our needs. So we can change the grid density, the scaling, the offset, and also the rotation of the different grids to create different patterns, which is quite interesting, I think. And I try to make this as similar as it makes sense to Photoshop. So let's have a look at what we're going to be building in here. So we have 4 main sections. One is the input, with all the instancing data, the actual instancing and rendering, and then some post-processing. So also in the post-processing, we can add something like bloom. And if we were to maybe change back to this image and change the grid density to something higher, or like the scaling to something higher, maybe the grid density like that. But yeah, like that you can kind of see the bloom effect on it. I think that looks really sick. It looks less like a printing thing, but more like an old school display. Right, so as usual, I'm gonna delete all of that and let's just get started. Alright, so I'm gonna leave my inputs here and just delete my main component. And I've also got this little base component here where it's just an in and a null, which I've turned the display on for. So I'm doing that in here because I don't want to have that in the background every time. So then I'm also like going here, so you can just click on that and it's going to go on display, and you just select top viewer just to see that nicely. And I've also turned off the network editor grid, so you can right click anywhere, go on display, show or hide network editor grid. I think it's a bit cleaner for the tutorials. Alright, so let's get started. I'm going to add a null, and I'm just going to call this input. Right click anywhere and collapse selected. So we've created a base, and I'm going to call this halftone. So it's going to be our main base, and I'm going to just make this a bit bigger and give it a color. So on my input now, I'm just going to make that a bit bigger and give it a color. It's going to be quite important. And we want to set up the sort of input here. So if we middle mouse click on here, well, I've actually added a res on here, so it's not too high res, but the original is quite high. In the end, it's not going to matter that much, but for now, make sure that your image isn't too high res, because what we're going to do is we're going to instance all of the pixels. Basically, we're going to create a point, or actually in the end 3 points for every color, for every pixel. So it's going to be a lot of points. So make sure that we go down with that res. We're going to do that now anyways. So I'm going to add a fit. And on this fit, we have to make sure that we take the input. So we use input. So we have the same resolution and aspect ratio. And then what I'm going to do is use a resolution top here. So on here, I'm just going to go ahead and change this to custom resolution and just put this on here and say dot width and dot height. It's a very quick and easy way to do this, and I'm going to divide this by 4. Alright, so now the amount of instances we have is down to like around 120,000, which is still quite a lot, but it's a lot better. Right, I'm going to add a ramp because we want to build a grid now. So I add a ramp here and just changed it to set resolution only. And actually, I kind of feel like working with the Shiba. So I'm actually not going to go down with the resolution that much, maybe just like by 2, divided by 2. Well, all right. So I'm going to change this to just being red. So make sure you're in RGB here. So just click on those colors. And I'm going to copy and paste this and change it to vertical and go down with my, yeah, just make sure you've selected this color. And I'm going to go down with red and blue. There we go. Want to have green and red. So what I'm going to do now is add a math to both of these channels and a reorder. So reorder and then add this green as a second input, output green, input 2. So we have this nice gradient. Okay, and now I just add a null and call it pause. And we want to have a look at the render network. So for that, we want to add a circle as well as a transform. And we want to have really small really small circles. So on our transform, we want to go down to like 0.002. And we might want to give this a color as well, because it's going to be important later on. And from here, by right-clicking on the output, I'm going to add a geo, go to instance and turn this on. I'm going to add a render top. And I'm going to use the same resolutions as here. So again, I'm going to just put that on here and just type in width and dot height. All right. So now we also definitely want to have a camera. And on view, I'm going to change this to orthographic. And on my render, I'm going to add a few things. So just HSV adjust. We're going to look at that later on. I'm going to add a transform and add black as my background and add an out. So we're sending out the data, and I'm not actually going to turn a display on, but just send that into my display here. So now you can see we're working on the texture there. All right, so what we want to do now, we want to add a material to this. So I'm going to call this CR for color R, and I'm going to just get rid of B and G and just put that on here. I'm going to copy these 2 times, call this CG, yes to all, and B, yes to all. And then I'm going to get rid of the red here and just make it green, and same thing for blue. All right, so now we have 3 tiny dots that are overlaid onto each other. So on my geo now, I'm going to select all 3 geos and use pause for translation and use R and G for X and Y. So that looks pretty awful for now. And the problem is that it's like going from 0 to 1 and not from like minus something to plus something. So let's change that on our math. For now, let's just type in minus 0.5 and 0.5. And you can see now it goes from 0 to 0.5 because it's not 32-bit float. So we definitely need to make sure to change this to 32-bit float. And then we might also want to move our camera a bit closer. You can already see it's still quite a lot of points, so actually maybe dividing it by 3 was better. But we're going to make this all dynamic later on. Okay, so now we can only see red because they're all the same size and position, so they're just like being stacked onto each other. So we're going to want to turn on blending. I'm not sure why, but for some reason when we're adding red, green, and blue, I think it should be white, but with add that doesn't work. So we've got to change that to maximum. And you're going to see why that's important later on. Now let's work on the color channels, kind of the most important part. So we're going to add a channel mix from here. And now I just want to extract red here. So I don't want any alpha, I don't want any blue or green. So I can just put everything to 0 except for red and red channel. And I'm going to add a transform here, just call it transform R. And another null here, and I'm going to just call this red. All right, so what we can do now is just copy these twice. And then on the red here, I'm going to go to 0, and on the green here to 1. And I'm going to do the same thing with blue. Call transform G and transform B. And let's call this green and blue. All right, all nice and clean. And you're gonna notice important later on. I actually kind of like to give these black color. And now I'm gonna use my red on the first one and use R for my scaling. Doing the second one, like the same thing for the second one. So G for the scale here, and the same thing for the third one, B for the scale here. And you can already see we're nicely representing our colors in a grid. So again, we might want to even go further down with the grid density so we can kind of see every point. And we can move closer with our camera to see it better. Gotta love that image. All right, so the next thing is we want to rotate this grid. So there's a few steps we have to take to do that. So first off, we can just go ahead and rotate one by 45, one maybe by 60, and one by 80 degrees. All right, so you see a bunch of problems that are coming up now. So the first one, very obvious, is that we're cutting off quite a bit of the image when rotating. So we're gonna fix that. Then the second thing is that the colors are very off. And the third thing is that if we look here, just gonna love that Shiba. The problem here is that the grid is still like horizontal and vertical. It's still perfectly straight, but it didn't rotate with the image. So actually what we want to do is we're gonna start by changing that. So what we can do here is we can use our rotation that we have on here and just reference that on our rotation Z here. So paste the reference and then just invert it. So times -1. So basically we're rotating the grid here like 45 degrees, and then we're rotating the actual, like here we're just rotating the color data, like the texture, and here we're actually like rotating the grid back to its original with the same amount of degrees. So we're just kind of going back, and still by doing that, because we're still rotating the grid, like it's not straight anymore. It's like we rotated the grid as well. Hope that makes sense. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing here. Actually, I can just paste select both of these, paste the reference as well. And on my green, I'm just going to type in G here for transform G. Now you can notice why it's important to be clean with these kind of things. And there we go. Okay. Just forgot this -1 times -1. There we go. So the colors are kind of back to normal, but we still have kind of the problem that of things being cut off, and we can also see that there's parts where there's just no grid. Well, it's really like this problem here. So to counter that problem, we added this fit in the beginning, and here we can just go down to. We're going to start with 0.5. We're going to go lower later on to explain something. But now you can already see, as we're moving down with this to 0.5, there's nothing being cut off. With some images, there still might be, but we're going to look at that in a second. So what we can just do now is move closer with our camera. So for now, that's going to be manual, but that will be automatic later on. So we can move closer to the image, and now we actually have a quite perfect halftone representation of our image. So with rotation and everything. So if I were to rotate the green here, you can now see it creates different patterns. So it works pretty nicely. All right, so let's look at how we can automatically set the camera, because we definitely don't want to change it. So just to show you what the problem is here, if we were to change it to this image, we actually see a lot of problems. So before we look at this camera, I want to show you something else too. And that is looking at these ranges, right? Because we don't have an aspect ratio of 1:1, which this currently is, right? Just going from -0.5 to 0.5, and the same thing here. So what this is kind of mapping as is it's kind of expecting an aspect ratio of 1:1. So here we actually have a very different aspect ratio. So what we can do is to use again our input. Just going to put down here. I'm going to put a minus before the first one, and then just type in .width and divide it by 1000, and then height, and again divided by 1000. First looks really off, but we can just copy this and paste the reference here. No, paste the expressions here. And I did something wrong actually. So height for both here, and then width for both here, because here we're actually working with X, so like the horizontal, so width, and here we were just working with height. So you can already see the aspect ratio is correct, and now we've just got to change our ortho width back, so the zoom basically. So let's go down with the grid density. Actually, the other way around. Looks pretty nice, right? It's already working quite well. Let's now make the ortho width automatic. So what I want to do now is add a constant here. Felt like this is kind of the easiest way to do this. And we want to, again, let's just call it, let's change this to zoom, and put that in here, OP input, and then dot width divided by 1000. And I'm going to add a null to this. Let's just call this one zoom 2. Go on our camera and put that here. And now you can see it's actually exactly perfectly zoomed in. So if we were to change to a different image, you can see it's still perfectly zoomed in. So that works very nicely. There is a problem though, with an image like this, for example. You can see it's being cut off slightly still. So if we go back here, we can actually see, especially with the green, we can see the rotation here is still like cutting off something. So 0.5 isn't really, 0.5 here isn't really the value I want to use in the end, more like 0.4. But then again, we have to adjust our zoom. So basically with 1000, we're perfectly relating to making it smaller by 0.5, if that makes sense. And now we have to adjust to the 0.4. So we have to change it to 1250. So now the rotation is going to be perfect for any aspect ratio pretty much. If it isn't, you just have to adjust the scaling even lower and then adjust that here. But I think for most images, it's going to be fine. So again, if I were to change it to another image, you can see it still works perfectly. So we have a lot of different things we can play around with now. So for example, we have the grid here, like the grid density, which we have to now change manually like this, which is really annoying. We have all of these rotations that we have to kind of go through one by one, and we have the scaling as well, right? So all of these parameters we now want to change to custom parameters that we can change really easily on here from the outside, so we don't have to actually go inside there every time. So what we have to do is customize this component and create a lot of parameters here. So the first one is grid density. There we go. And I'm just going to create all of the different parameters first and then look at them one by one. So scale, offset, and then we want to have the rotation for R, so rotate R. What I'm going to do is just copy that twice and just call it rotate G once, and then rotate B. I'm going to select all of these and change the range to 360. And the default for the first one I'm going to change to 45, for the second one to 60, and for the third one to 80. These are really just random values, you can use any. And last but not least, add a color parameter and change the default to 1 actually. Okay, and then we can open up our parameters, go to the custom page. So we have a floating window here, which is very handy. And now we might want to change the ranges and defaults. So for grid density, what we're referring to is what I already showed you, is that value here that we're dividing things by. So we want to do a range minimum of 1 and a maximum of 10, and the default is going to be around 2 or 3, whatever you like. And then what we can do is just we can copy this parameter, and I'm actually just going to paste the reference here, which is kind of random, but I'm just going to cut it away from here again, and then I can again paste it in here. works pretty nicely. So now we can actually change the grid density with this. So it might actually, for user experience, it might make more sense to call it grid spacing because we're going up further, but I don't really care right now. So for the scale, what we're referring to is the transform here. So the uniform scale. So we want to have a default of 0.002. That's already what we have. That's working well. And as a minimum, we might want to have 0.001. And as a maximum, 0.007. So again, we can copy this parameter and just paste the reference here. And now with the scaling, we can change the scaling. So then the offset, the next one, is referring to something we haven't really looked at all. It's using this translation here. So if we just look at our image, I can translate one of the colors to right or right, left, or up, down. So that would be the offset. So for the offset, we just want to have a very small value. Default is 0 and maximum is 0.01. And then we can just right click and copy this parameter. And I'm gonna, for red and blue, I'm gonna paste the reference here, and for green on Y. And then here I'm just gonna put a minus before. So now if we go up with the offset, you can kind of see they're going away from each other. And as you can see, if you go higher, it doesn't make that much sense. So that's why I have this range. It looks kind of nice though. All right, and then let's actually get rid of this. We don't need that anymore. For the transform, I'm going to select all of them, just copy one of these rotation values, and then paste the reference here. Then I'm going to select my G, change it to G, and same thing here with B. So now I can rotate. You can't actually see it that well for B for some reason, but with G and R you can definitely see it very well. And now the cool thing is, because we have set defaults, we can right click and reset custom parameters, and then we have our default values, which kind of work well on most images. Okay, we all still have this color here, so I can copy this parameter, go to my HSV adjust, and just paste the reference on my saturation multiplier. So if I go down now, we have a black and white image, which kind of, it doesn't really make sense looking at halftone, but I think it's still a very cool effect, I think. So it's kind of fun to play around with. One thing I also want to do here is if I go back to customizing the component, is adding sections. Just make everything a bit more clean and divide the different sections. So one last thing I want to show you here is adding bloom. So we can now get rid of this and open up the palette, image filters, bloom. Just drag it in here and connect that to our image. We want to go down with the threshold, maybe go up with the intensity a bit. I might want to go up with the grid density and the scale. Yeah, I feel like this is a good value. And then the bloom is just, it's a really nice effect, I think. So you can play around with that. So if you go down the contrast, I think it looks even nicer. And so if we were to take another image, you kind of have to adjust it for the different images. Man, I love this Shiba. So if we go down with the scale here and the grid density again, you can see it also works for that. So that's something that you might notice now, that when we have different resolutions, we have to readjust our grid density. So that could be something like a sort of task or homework, even though I just despise that word, for you to figure out how can you make this more dynamic to the input. So if you have an input image of 500 by 500 or an image of 2000 by 2000, how can you sort of do it in a way that the grid density is responding to that? So the output would be the same, no matter whether you have an image of like a high resolution or a low resolution image. So that would be something for you to figure out if you're up for it. It's possible. I did that as well, but I feel like that would kind of explode the scope of the video. God, I'm kind of just going bananas after recording for a long time. Right, but yeah, that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I just want to give a huge shout out to all of the patrons that are supporting me, or that have been supporting me for such a long time. And it's wonderful, and I'm deeply grateful for being able to do this work and to even be I was sick for a long time, and I was still supported by this community. I'm just very, very grateful. So yeah, huge thank you for all of the patrons, to all of the patrons. And then also, if you want to support me and have some extra content, you can check out my Patreon too. All right, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.